see the teeth that are present, and these teeth, they are present over a solid nodule or protuberance type of a structure, which we call as Rokitansky sinus. Rokitansky nodule. So this is the classic specimen of teratoma. Now these teratomas, they are usually classified into either mature, immature, or monodermal, or the highly specialized teratomas. Now teratomas are the group of neoplasms in which you find varying proportions of all the three germ layers. The structures are formed from all the three ecto, meso, and the endodermal linings. In the mature or the benign teratomas, they are usually found in the young females, while the immature ones, they have the malignant potential. Now this immaturity of a teratoma, you need to find out the neuroepithelial cells which are present. So for immaturity, you need to find the neuroepithelium. Now these immature teratomas, they are usually seen in the prepubertal adolescents or in the young women. Monodermals, or the highly specialized one, so they will have the derivatives of a single germ layer. So for example, this Struma overi, so that is the monodermal teratoma. Now mostly these benign teratomas, they are bilateral, and they have a unilocular cyst which might contain the hair or the sebaceous material. The cyst wall, it is thin walled and opaque gray white, and has protruding hair shafts. Within the wall, you might find the grossly evident tooth structures, as we just saw in the current specimen, and then they can also be areas of calcification. These cartilaginous areas or the osseous areas, these are also found over the solid nodule or the Rokitansky protuberance. So that is the significance of this structure. Coming to the second gross specimen. Now in this, in the lower half, you can see this blackish. This is the endometrial cavity. So this is a formalin fixed bed mount specimen of uterus. Okay, you do not have the attached cervix in this, and in this you can see that the entire, so this black one is the endometrium, and rest of the entire specimen, it is composed of the myometrium, and inside the myometrium you have an intramural fibroid. Now this intramural fibroid, it is sharply delineated. Okay, and sorry, in this I just mentioned with cervix, it is without cervix. Okay, only the uterus is seen in this, with the intramural leiomyoma, which is a sharply circumscribed, discrete, round, firm gray white tumor. Now leiomyomas are the smooth muscle neoplasms, and based on their location, they can be either intramural inside the myometrium, or they may be submucosal just beneath the endometrium, or subserosal. Now, characteristically, on cut section, they have whorled pattern of smooth muscle bundles. And depending upon the size, if they are very large, then they may develop yellow to brown to red areas of softening. Usually these patients with fibroids, they can be asymptomatic or present with abnormal uterine bleeding. There can be increased frequency of urination. The fibroid is quite large, so there can be sudden pain from the infarction in the fibroid, and they usually lead to impaired fertility. In pregnancy, they may increase in size, and they may also increase the frequency of spontaneous abortions or fetal malpresentations, uterine inertias, or increase the risk of postpartum hemorrhages. Now, malignant transformation to leiomyosarcomas in leiomyoma is rare. So the third specimen that we have is again a cystic structure, and it is gray white. Now in this, the patient is a 52-year-old female who presented with lower abdominal pain. So lower abdominal pain in a 52-year female. So first differential that will keep in a cystic origin structure would be the ovaries, and in this we have a thin-walled cyst, and this specimen is of the serous epithelial ovarian tumors. Now, as we know that the ovarian tumors, they can be either the they have the epithelial origin, and in the epithelial tumors we have the serous, mucinous, Brenner's, clear cell, and the endometrioid type of epithelial neoplasms. Now, the serous epithelial ovarian tumors, they can be further classified into either benign, borderline, or malignant. and these are the most common ovarian neoplasms that occur, and majority of the ovarian neoplasms are the epithelial tumors. About 70% of these serious tumors, they are benign or borderline, and only 30% they are malignant. And they're most common between the benign and borderline tumors. They're most common between the ages of 20 to 45. During the later life, the serous carcinomas are seen, or they may occur at earlier ages in the familial cases. Now, these serous tumors, they may present as a multicystic lesion, in which characteristically you find the papillary areas, the papillary epithelium, it is contained within the fibrous walled cyst, or it may present as a mass projecting from the ovarian surface. So, ovarian capsular invasion is one characteristic feature of malignancy in these tumors. The benign tumors, they typically have a smooth glistening cyst wall, and there are no areas of epithelial thickening. There may be some focal areas of papillary projections. The borderline tumors, they have increased number of papillary projections compared to the benign one. And if you find larger areas of solid or papillary tumor growth, or the tumor is irregular, or fixation or nodularity of the capsules are seen, then these are the features which point towards the malignancy malignancy in these serous tumors. So bilaterality is very common, and 20% of the benign serous adenomas are bilateral, while 66% of the serous carcinomas, they are bilateral. So coming to the fourth specimen, this is again from the ovary, and in this, it is a multiloculated cystic ovary. So multiloculation is more common in the mucinous tumors, and they account for about 20 to 25% of all the ovarian neoplasms. Compared to the serous ones, they are less frequent, and they principally occur in the mid-adult life. They are very rare before the puberty or after the menopause. The vast majority of these tumors, they are benign or borderline, and the primary ovarian mucinous carcinomas, they are uncommon. They account only for 3% of the ovarian cancers. So the surface of the ovary, it is rarely involved in case of mucinous neoplasms. However, in serous ones, there is more frequent ovarian surface involvement, in which case these tumors, they tend to be more malignant. So the mucinous tumors, they produce larger cystic masses compared to the serous ones, and they have multiloculated areas in which sticky gelatinous fluid rich in glycoproteins is usually found. In the serous ones, you will find a more clear and serous appearing straw colored fluid. Coming to the fifth specimen, in this you can see this is the specimen of uterus with cervix, and in this particular specimen, there is no attached bilateral adnexal structure. That is, there is no attached fallopian tube or ovary that can be seen. So in this one, you can see that this being the endometrial cavity, the uterine fundus in body, and at the lower end where the cervical end should be, you can see there is a large exophytic mass. So this particular is the formalin fixed specimen of uterus with cervix, in which you can see the exophytic growth, which is involving the cervix. So mostly seen in cases of carcinoma cervix, and the average age of patients presenting with carcinoma cervix tends to be 45 to 50 years. The various risk factors for the same being high risk human papilloma virus infections. Now, the HPV 16-18, these are the most important factors in the development of cervical cancers. And apart from the HPV infection, the CINs, or the cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, these are also the pre-malignant lesions leading on to cervical carcinomas. Now, CINs, they are classified depending upon the epithelium involvement. So if the dysplasia is mild, moderate, severe, depending upon the whether it is present in the lower 1/3 or it is present up to the lower 2/3 of the epithelium, that will be moderate dysplasia. And in severe dysplasia, more than 2/3 of the epithelium is dysplastic. The difference being in severe dysplasia and carcinoma in situ, only of that in carcinoma carcinoma in situ and severe dysplasia, both of them, they fall under the high grade squamous intraepithelial lesion classification. So it is just that the lesion, it is confined to the basement membrane. So if there is breach in the basement basement membrane, then you will call it as frank carcinoma cervix. So staging of carcinoma cervix is very important. In stage 0, the carcinoma is in situ, or it is CIN3 or HCL. In stage 1, the carcinoma is confined to the cervix. One is further classified as 1A and 1B. 1A being the preclinical carcinoma. It is only diagnosed by microscopy, in which 1A1 and 1A2 are further categorizations. In 1A1, you have to look out for the stromal invasion, which should be no deeper than 3 mm and it should not be wider than 7 mm. So these are also known as the superficially invasive squamous cell carcinomas. And in 1A2, the maximum depth of the invasion of stroma, it should be deeper than 3 mm but not deeper than 5 mm, and the horizontal invasion should be no more than 7 mm. So these are the microscopically visible preclinical carcinomas. Then coming to stage 1B, it is histologically invasive carcinoma, which is confined to the cervix. Then stage 2 is carcinoma, which extends beyond the cervix but not to the pelvic wall, and it involves the vagina, but the lower third of the vagina is spared. In stage 3, the carcinoma extends to the pelvic wall, and there is no free space between the tumor and the pelvic wall on rectal examination that can be seen. The tumor here involves the lower third of the vagina as well. In stage 4 carcinomas, we can see that the carcinoma extends beyond the true pelvis, and it can either involve the mucosa of the bladder or rectum or both. And this stage also includes the cancers which have wide metastatic dissemination. So classification of cervical carcinomas is very important. Coming to the next specimen. In this we can see this is the enlarged, grossly enlarged specimen of uterus, and lower end of cervix is not discernible. There is no attached bilateral adnexal structure. However, the uterine cavity, it is completely filled with these grape-like vesicular structures. So this is the classical specimen for hydatidiform mole, H mole, and again, we can see on grossly the hypertrophied uterus with delicate fibril masses of thin walled translucent grape-like structures consisting of swollen edematous hydropic villi. Now, H mole, it is classified as either being a complete mole or a partial mole. In complete mole, it involves all or most of the villus tissue. The chorionic villi, they are enlarged, they are scalloped in shape with central cavitation, which are known as cisterns. So cisternal dilatation is one thing that we can see on microscopy as well, and they are covered by extensive trophoblastic proliferation. And this trophoblastic proliferation, it involves the entire circumference of the villi. However, in partial moles, only a fraction of villi, they are enlarged and edematous, and the trophoblastic hyperplasia, it is very focal and it is less marked as compared to a complete mole. Now, these complete and partial moles, they are associated with an increased risk of persistent trophoblastic disease. So these persistent trophoblastic disease can either take the form of either invasive mole or choriocarcinoma. Now, these H moles, they are diagnosed during the early pregnancy, around 8 to 9 weeks, and these can be easily picked up by the pelvic ultrasound. They can, however, develop at any age. The risk being higher towards the two ends of the reproductive life, in the teenagers and towards 40 to 50 years of age. So how does a complete mole form? Complete mole, it can either occur by the insemination of an empty ovum, and further there can be chromosomal duplication of the sperm leading to a homozygous complete mole. Or a complete mole can also form by diaspermy, and again it inseminates an empty ovum, in which case it leads to a heterozygous complete mole with a karyotype of either 46XX or 46XY. In case of partial mole, the ovum has the haploid genotype of 23X, and diaspermy occurs, either 23X or Y, and subsequently you'll get a population of triploid partial mole structures in which the karyotype, it can be 69 triple X, 69XXY, or 69XYY, which is very rare. So how does a mole occur? So you should be knowing about that. Coming to the next slide. In this, we have a 58-year-old female who presented with a history of uterine prolapse. What we can see over here is the arrow marked structure depicts the stratified squamous epithelium. You can see the various layers of the stratified squamous epithelium, and underneath that, some glandular structures, they are present. So, ectocervix, in cervix, we have both the squamous component as well as the glandular component. So the ectocervix, which is also visible on the vaginal examination, it is usually covered by a mature squamous type of epithelium. Endocervix is covered by a columnar epithelium, which is mucin secreting epithelium. Now the point where the squamous and the columnar epithelium, they meet, that is known as the squamo-columnar junction or the transformation zone. Now this transformation zone is very important because it is highly susceptible to infection with the human papilloma virus, which can further lead to cervical cancers. So the immature squamous cells in the transformation zone, they are the most susceptible ones. Now the replacement of the glandular epithelium, that is the columnar epithelium, by the squamous epithelium, it is referred to as the squamous metaplasia. So in this slide, we can see that there are some glandular elements and there are intervening stromal cells. So this is how a normal proliferative phase of endometrium will look like. So these structures marked by the arrow, these are the mitotic figures. The mitotic figures, they are usually seen during the proliferative phase of the endometrium, which lasts from day 7 to around day 14. So in the initial or the menstrual phase, there will be shedding type of endometrium that we can see on the histopathological examination, subsequent to which, under the influence of LH and FSH hormones, there will be proliferation of these glands, endometrial glands, and there will be increase in the stratification, increase in the mitosis. There will be a very condensed stromal environment that can be seen. So the proliferative phase, it shows the rapid growth of glands and stroma, which arise from the deeper portion of the endometrium or the endometrium basalis. Now the glands in the proliferative phase, they are very straight tubular structures which are lined by regular tall pseudostratified columnar cells. Mitotic figures, they are numerous and there is no evidence of mucus secretion or vacuolation. Now the evidence of mucus secretion or vacuolation is something that you'll look out for in the secretory phase of the endometrium. The endometrial stroma, in case of proliferative endometrium, would be composed of spindle cells with scant amount of cytoplasm that are also actively proliferating. Now in this slide, compared to the previous one, the glands, they are quite dilated. Glands have apical vacuolations and apical mucin that is present. Glands, they are also seen to have the secretions. So as you can see, and the stroma, compared to the proliferative phase, it is less compact. So this is the slide of secretory endometrium or the post-ovulatory endometrium, in which you can see the secretory vacuoles which tend to first appear beneath the nucleus in the glandular epithelium, and with the progression of the cycle, they come towards the apical surface, and for subsequently the secretions, they are drained into the gland lumen. The secretory activity is most prominent during the 3rd week of the menstrual cycle, and by the 4th week, the glands, they tend to become more tortuous and they have a typical serrated appearance. Now, this serrated or sawtooth appearance, this is accentuated by the secretory exhaustion and further shrinkage of the glands, they occur. So this is the thing that we saw just about the glandular epithelium. The secretory changes, they also appear in the stroma. So the stromal changes in the late secretory phase, they are predominantly due to the hormone progesterone. And in this, we can see there is prominent spiral arterioles that can be seen, and there is increase in the ground substance and edema between the stromal cells. So the compactness of the stroma, it is lost, and edema fluid, it percolates between the cells. this stromal cell hypertrophy occurs, there is increased cytoplasmic eosinophilia. Now, this eosinophilia, it is referred to as the pre-decidual change, and stromal mitosis can also be present. Now, pre-decidual changes, they spread throughout the functionalis, they are accompanied by a sparse infiltrate of neutrophils and lymphocytes. And lymphocytes and neutrophils, they are considered to be normal. However, if you find the presence of plasma cells in the stromal interspersed between the stromal cells, then that is one feature which points towards the endometritis, chronic endometritis that can be present in the patient. So this slide, this is of a 23-year-old female who presented with abdominal pain, she had fever and low back pain and vaginal discharge. So in the microscopic picture that is seen, you can see that there is something, a tubular structure is present in which lining epithelium, it is sent into folds, and this lining epithelium is somewhat cuboidal to columnar, and along with that there is increase in infiltrate, chronic inflammatory infiltrate that is present. So this is one slide of this is salpingitis. So in salpingitis, the normal tubal mucosa. So to identify a tube, you have to see the tubal lumen, and you have to identify the muscle that is present outside. And to call it as salpingitis, you need to find the evidence of inflammation in that. So initially what happens in salpingitis is that the tubal mucosa, it becomes congested, which is then infiltrated by neutrophil plasma cells and lymphocytes. And all of these inflammatory cells, they lead to epithelial injury, and there is knocking off of the plicae. The tubal lumen, it then fills with the purulent exudate, and this purulent exudate, it may leak out of the fimbriated end. And once it leaks out, it can spread to the ovary, causing salpingo-oophorytis. Now, this exudate, it can also accumulate within the ovary and the tube and can lead to the formation of tubo-ovarian abscesses, or it can be contained within the tubal lumen, in which case pyosalpinx can occur. So acute salpingitis can also convert to chronic salpingitis over if it is untreated. And once chronic salpingitis sets in, then there is scarring of the tubal lumens, and the fimbriae, they mean the uptake and passage of oocytes, and that can lead to infertility or ectopic pregnancy in these patients. Hydrosalpinx can also develop. So the most common causative organism for salpingitis is Neisseria gonorrhea, and it is also the most serious complication of gonorrhea seen in women. Then apart from Neisseria, chlamydia can also cause salpingitis. Apart from that, puerperal infections caused by polymicrobes like staph, streptococci, coliforms, and Clostridium perfringens. These are the other causative agents which can be seen during these spontaneous or induced abortions, or during normal or abnormal deliveries. So next is a specimen in which you can see this is the uterus. The lower end cervix is also visible. There is no bilateral adnexal structure that is attached. So we have a case of a 56 female who presented with abnormal uterine bleeding. And on the cut section of the uterus and cervix, the uterine cavity, it is filled with these exophytic structures. So exophytic fungating growth is seen in the endometrial cavity in the body of the uterus, and this is also extending up to the lower uterine segment. So the most probable diagnosis in this case would be endometrioid adenocarcinoma. And these endometrioid adenocarcinomas, they show the glandular growth patterns. Now, depending upon the amount of gland formation, they can be classified as grade 1, 2, or 3, either well differentiated, moderately differentiated, or poorly differentiated. So if we have a tumor entirely composed of well-formed glands, then we call it as well differentiated. If the well-formed glands are also seen along with the areas of solid sheets of cells, but these sheets of cells are less than 50% or less of the tumor, so we categorize them as moderately differentiated tumors. And then we have the poorly differentiated tumors, in which the solid growth pattern, it is seen in more than 50% of the tumor area. So these endometrial tumors, they are categorized into type 1 or type 2. Now the age group for type 1 is comparatively younger. being 55 to 65 years, and type 2 develops over 65 to 75 years. Type 1 tumors, they are usually seen in cases where there is unopposed estrogen exposure. Now, these patients can be either obese, hypertensive, diabetes, all the features of metabolic syndrome can be found in these patients. And the type 2 patients, there is usually atrophy of the endometrium, and these patients are very thin in physique. So the characteristic morphology in type 1 is of endometrioid. However, type 2 can either be serous, clear cell, or mixed Mullerian tumor. Precursor lesion for type 1 is usually endometrial hyperplasia. In type 2, it is serous endometrial intraepithelial carcinomas. And you should be knowing about various mutated gene abnormalities that can occur in type 1 and type 2. The type 1 tumors, they are usually indolent and they spread via lymphatics. The type 2 tumors are more aggressive and they also show intraperitoneal and lymphatic spread. So endometrial hyperplasia is one thing that is associated with prolonged estrogenic stimulation of the endometrium. Now, this can occur either due to anovulation, it can occur due to the increased estrogen production from the endogenous sources, or there can be a history of exogenous estrogen supplementation. So these patients can either have obesity, menopausal patients, or polycystic ovarian syndrome patients, or someone who is having functioning granulosa cell tumors of the ovary, or there can be either excessive ovarian cortical function, or they can be prolonged administration of estrogenic substances as in estrogen replacement therapy. So all of these can lead to endometrial hyperplasia, which can subsequently lead to type 1 endometrial carcinomas. So coming to the next specimen, in this we can see there is uterus with cervix at the bottom, and to the uterine cornu, the fallopian tube is attached, and also you can see bilaterally grossly enlarged ovarian structures, and the ovaries are solid and partly cystic with variegated appearance and bosselated exterior. So this is uterus with cervix attached bilateral adnexa, bilateral gross enlargement, solid cystic variegated growth, and it is a classical metastatic gastrointestinal carcinoma in which the ovaries are involved, bilateral ovaries are involved. We call this as Krukenberg tumor. Now, this Krukenberg tumor, it is composed of mucin-producing cancer cells, and they have signet ring appearance. These tumors, they arise from the gastric neoplasms. The most common metastatic tumor of the ovary are the tumors of Mullerian origin, either coming from the uterus, fallopian tube, or the contralateral ovary or the pelvic peritoneum. The most common extramullerian tumors metastatic to the ovaries, we can see them coming from the carcinoma breast, gastrointestinal tract being colon, stomach, biliary tract, pancreas. Then you can also find pseudomyxoma peritonei, which are derived from the appendiceal tumors. So that is all for FGT. The slides, various slides and specimen. Any query anyone has? Shall we end it here? Okay, I have few questions. Just a second, I'll try to answer them one by one. How teratoma arise from the ovary? Ovary does not contain all three germ layers. Okay. Then we have, how can we distinguish serous from mucinous on gross appearance? How can we distinguish serous from mucinous again? Okay. So serous and mucinous on gross is basically serous. Majority is usually benign serous or borderline serous, and these tumors, they tend to be more unilocular compared to the mucinous tumors, which are multiloculated. Then the type of fluid that is present, the serous one will have a clear watery type of fluid that will be present. However, in the mucinous, it will be more gelatinous in consistency and mucoidish material that will be present. serous tumors, since borderline and malignant ones, they have papillary projections. So you can find areas, solid cystic areas, in which you can find the papillary excrescences either inside the ovary, or if malignant, then they can also cause the capsular breach and they will be present on the ovarian surface. However, we have just seen that the mucinous ones, they are very rare as malignant. So that is how grossly serous and mucinous they are distinguished. Mucinous also tend to have a very enormously enlarged ovarian size. So grossly, these are the various pointers towards serous or mucinous. And ovary does not contain all the germ layers. Basically, ovarian neoplasms that you have, they can be either your epithelial tumors or the germ cell tumors. Now, germ cell tumors can develop both in the ovaries as well as in the testes. It doesn't necessarily have to contain the 3 germ layers. It is just the genetic mutations that are happening and that are driving the normal cells to form all the 3 germ layers. So definitely it is malignant. So it does not have to have the 3 germ layers as inherently as a normal constituent. So that question, I think, is answered there. Apart from these 2 questions, anyone else has any query? Any doubt, anyone else? Shall we end it here? We'll end it here then. Thank you all.